Hello, how are we doing?
Hello, everybody.
All right. Last time, I think I had a podium. I'm short, so I might have to like do this every now and then to see people's faces. I'm okay with that though. So yeah, this is Benoit's first Olio, my second. That doesn't necessarily make me an expert, but I thought that the way Benoit and I met was an interesting story, and so I thought that Benoit would be a good person to kick it off because we met on a walking tour. Yeah.
So, welcome everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be here tonight. The way we started is very simple. We had this little map, which got me puzzled. Well, I've been at the New School for 3 years. I come from Switzerland. My work is on the Middle East, so I do not work on the United States. I work at the New School, where there is a long tradition of working on Marxist sociology, historical sociology, and recently I've been working on question of settler colonialism, comparing process of colonization in various parts of the world, in Ireland, in the United States, the British colonies becoming the US, Algeria, Palestine. And I've taught a class for a couple of years called Sugar and Cotton and the Making of Global Capitalism. So it's an introduction to undergrad students about what is capitalism, where does capitalism arise, what are the social processes that transform our lives because of capitalism. And so doing a class here in New York, there is a unique opportunity to actually discover the layers, the history of capitalism. So that's where I get to this map. This is the Colonial New York, New Amsterdam. And for the class, I try to bring the students to the streets of New York and New Amsterdam. And so I organized a walking tour, or I relied on people who have expertise and know how to handle the walking tour. And so last year I had the chance to be in touch with Kamau, who came and met with my class and did one of those historical tours. So that's how we got to know each other. And there was a good vibe, and we felt that there was a lot in common. And so we stayed in touch, and we explore the possibility of doing one class. So, and that's how our two experiences come together as the faculty working on the history of capitalism, and Kamau digging deep in the history, the lived experience of rebellious bodies and resistance. So that's where maybe you want to say a couple of words.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat funny, and just a little disclaimer, I don't try to be funny. I just kind of have a sense of humor just like baked into how I see things. And so if I say something that's funny, I might not be trying to be funny. It just might just come out that way. But funny, like not like in a hilarious way, but my friends have been calling me professor for years. And I just kind of like told my friends today, like Benoit and I know like the class is filled up, but you know, I'll be officially a visiting professor at the New School. And I think the fact that we met, you know, on the streets of New York sounds kind of gangster, but it's just like real nerdy instead. Where he like brought his class, we're having a conversation.
Swiss gangsters, careful.
Right, the best type. Speaking of gangsters, it sounded like your students, after you came back from the walking tour, were kind of like, we liked being outside, having experiences, having conversations in places, and they really were, I think, pushing the idea as well to have this conversation as having like a class. And so I'm really excited, and I thankful for Benoit for pulling together the proposal and bringing me into the faculty of the New School. And so today, this is like our first dance. You know, we've been having brunch at Miss Lily's and eating ackee and plantain. And today, we're actually going to give a chance to, talk about our different interests and how they combine. And you're going to hear this concept layers again and again, because from a historical standpoint and from my vantage point as an artist and a historian, the layers of New York are very much like a Photoshop document. And if you can look at the different layers, you have a lot more of a rich, powerful experience versus the way things are often compressed as if this is the image you want you to have, but don't give you opportunity to interact with all the content. So on that note, Benoit's going to go first, but we're sitting here like fireside, chat style, because we're going to interrupt each other from time to time, because that's what we do.
Yes. So I'll start by just saying something about capitalism, this big word out there, and maybe Kamau can say something about the contour of colonial New York. I mean, there's so much we could cover, or we should cover, that we're not going to be able. So we're just going to pinpoint a couple of historical moments in the history of this island and that this world will all live in. And so I'll start just by saying something about capitalism. Okay, it's about global capitalism, and this is an essential point. We have a focus on the history of Mannahatta being colonized. being part of this expanding system of capitalism, but it's about a global story that we cannot escape from. Capitalism is transforming the reality of our lives here as it does on the other side of the planet. Okay, so this is the starting point. It's not just about capitalism; it's about global capitalism. And capitalism, you know, okay, we're not going to have a lecture about what is capitalism, but briefly, you know, capitalism is thought as a system of free economy, right? It's private actors as opposed to central planning, some form of socialism or communism. That's one understanding of capitalism. Capitalism, the second understanding, is a historical type of economy as opposed to mercantilism. Mercantilism was the dominant idea of behind trade and thinking economy until the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And mercantilism believes that there are a certain amount of wealth that exists within the national borders. And you cannot expand this wealth. It's just about trading, or you can attack the next country, the neighbor, and you can try to get more wealth. Capitalism comes as a new idea, as a political idea, that of liberalism. Say we need to open the borders. We need to actually expand the commercial trades, and we need to have free labor, and we can expand. This is the idea of capitalism, the liberal defending the idea of capitalism in the 18th, 19th century. We open the borders, and we can accumulate even more wealth. Okay, and this is where the global dimension comes to play. And then capitalism, for the Marxists around here, right, capitalism is the race to the bottom, is the worsening of the production, the condition of production, because of the pressure to have higher productivity with lower protection for the workers. And Marx described capitalism as an economic, a political, and a social system that is about who owns the means of production. That's the economic dimension. There is a social component of it, that society is based around the struggle around classes, right? Class struggles, the proletariat versus the bourgeois. And then there is a political system that comes with it, right? The state that helps organizing this free market, right? Free market in quotation mark, because this is an illusion. We're going to talk about illusion today. So capitalism exists not just as an economic system. Capitalism is a historical force that transforms, that constantly retransforms and rebundles social relations. Social relations here, but also our social relations with other people outside of the place, the country, the city we live in. So that's why the history of colonial New York, and maybe you, Kamau, can say a couple of words about colonial New York, what it is, what we're looking at, is connected to global transformations.
Yeah, I'll just say, like in short, because I have a few more slides to get to, a nice handful, is you may have no idea of how much history there is in New York if you rely solely on the public square. If you walk around and you look at monuments and memorials and try to get some interpretation of where you're standing, you're going to be very limited. You're going to have a very serious compression JPEG moment where the information is going to be locked and it's going to be fixed. And so you have to dig deeper. You got to come to places like the Strand and libraries and dig into books and go on walking tours and find out a lot more about where you're standing and what you're in front of.
Okay. So let's move on to making comparison here. So we try to bring together three spaces, three places in New York, and we're trying to think what is at play, what happens with the emergence of global capitalism. So we're trying to think how we can compare three instances of spatial exclusion. That's what we discuss here, right? Kamau deals with the Black Gotham experience, the enslaved Black African or indentured labor who were forced into serving the colonial New York. So we're trying to compare three what we call blind spots of New York. The history of New York is a history of success, white success, and it marginalized the Black experience and other bodies of color. So there are three instances, and I could just go through images. First is, this is the dispossession of the native, of the First Nations. So you have 4 maps of the United States in 1850, 1865, 1880, and 1990, where the black spots are the lands held by Indians, First Nations, or returned to Indians. And so you have one process of dispossession and expropriation, right? This is the Lenape, or the people living in Mannahatta, who are pushed aside, right? They're marginalized from the island on which we are. The second is the population that Kamau tries to make revive, and this is the history of the African burial ground, or this is one of the instances of marginalization, the blind spots, is the history of the enslaved African people who were forced and sold or rented on the slave market here in New York, New Amsterdam, New York. And so this is a map of 1754 of Lower Manhattan, right? Here you have, so Wall Street would be here, so it's not New Amsterdam, but New York, and there is a little space here by this pound of fresh water, and there's a close-up of the map, which is about the Negro burial ground. This is a place where up to 15,000 former slaves were buried between the late 17th century until 1794, I believe. And this is the location where you have the African burial ground right now between Duane and Broadway Street in Lower Manhattan. And the history of this burial ground may be known to you. There were a project to build a new federal building for the IRS in the early 1990s, and they discovered this burial ground. And there were a lot of debates about trying to build the building very quickly and let's forget about the burial ground. And then there was a lot of pushback, and eventually the African burial ground was actually preserve a little space, right?
So I want to go a quick chime in while you have that slide there. Do we have, just to kind of give us a general sense, the area of New Amsterdam, New Netherlands, which is like a simultaneous way of looking at geography. New Amsterdam was more like the lower part of Lower Manhattan, like Wall Street down, and New Netherlands would have extended all the way from the tip of Manhattan down to like Delaware, would have also encompassed Albany as well. And so it's kind of like New Netherlands, like a larger area, and New Amsterdam was like the capital of New Netherlands. And this is part of coming out of war with the Spanish and the Portuguese when the Dutch come over here and establish this outpost. And so you have this timeline that goes from 1624 to 1664, but then you also have the beginning of New York City at that point in time, but you already having people that are of African descent being buried in various parts of the island, and you may be following some of the discovery of burial grounds in Bronx and in Queens, as well as it was by the federal building. And so when you talk about the African burial ground, you're talking about a range of different time periods where people might have been buried there during the time of New Amsterdam or New York City.
And so we have this map of 1754, right? So we know that there was this, we know that there was this burial ground there, yet we try to erase the presence. We try to forget about it the same way it was actually forgotten and marginalized in history in 1794, when the burial ground is closed, and what do we do with the land? It's sold. It's sold and it's developed. So they put simply new houses, and in 1890s you put a slab of concrete. So you had to dig 20 feet to actually find the remnants of the bodies. So it's not a story that we can pretend we didn't know about. There is a map saying that there was a burial ground, yet we totally obliterate and destroy that layer of history, okay? So this is another instance of dispossession, destruction of the memory. And the third instance is closer to us, and it's maybe more mundane. And this is, maybe you recognize the former Domino Sugar Factory. This is the Williamsburg Bridge right here. And this has been dismantled in 2014, 2015. And now this is a picture of the construction site. This is a rendering. I don't know if this is the actual way it's going to be built, but you see the Williamsburg Bridge. And so you have a development here of a working class site, and this is a process of gentrification. So people, again, are pushed outside of sites or works. And so the common point is it's not innocent, it's a sugar factory, and sugar has its origin in colonial history, okay? So this is a way to actually play with the, remind us that everywhere we set our foot in this island, we are always facing the history of colonialism, and we are facing a new layer, a new dimension of capitalism expansion, and the transformation of the land on which we live, and the social relation, pushing people out. And this is a map from the website Mannahatta project. This is a rendering of what Lower Manhattan was before colonization started. And here you have a rendering of the harbors and the expansion of the city with the city nowadays. So the contours, the physical contours of the cities we live in are actually the result of colonization, dispossession, and capitalist expansion, because those structures, those infrastructure, were built precisely to allow for the movement of new people, settlers, and the trade of sugar and produces commodities that matter greatly, that brought richesse in New York. So this is those few cases that we're going to try to discuss. So I don't know if you want to say something?
Now we're good. Sugarcoating.
Sugarcoating. So capitalism is we tend to think, or often we talk about capitalism, we think of capitalism in a given polity, in a given entity, and we try to, often we forget the other side of the coin, the negative dimension of capitalism as a historical force. So there is a dimension of embellishing capitalism. There is what I call sugarcoating, and sugarcoating is a play on words, of course, but it refers to the great book of Sidney Mintz, which I referred to at the end of the talk. We have a series, one slide with other books suggested for reading. So it's called Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. And Sidney Mintz explores and explains how sugar is not something that we all consume, or we don't have an innate taste for sugar, right? We say, oh, I have a sweet tooth. So there's this idea that we always had sugar and we like sugar. In reality, no, sugar was a spice. It was a luxury good that actually became consumed massively from the 18th century onwards. And the thesis of Mintz is that people were gradually used to or grew the disposition for sweet, treacle, molasses, low-quality sugar, jam, etc. in the 18th, late 18th, early 19th century, at a time when industrial capitalism started expanding. And sugar gave a shot of energy for the people who were peasant before and were forced gradually to sell their labor force in factories, right? So they were able to work longer hours because of the sugar that was given. So sugar-coating capitalism is a way to remember that behind the illusion or the embellished version of capitalism, there are various violent forces of separation, of dispossession. And I just listing a couple of those illusions. Capitalism makes us believe that we are free to sell our labor. Capitalism historically was based on the forcing of people to work at no fee, right, slaves, or at very low fees. Capitalism strives on the ability to make us believe that this is a land of opportunity, land of possibilities, right, the American dreams. And capitalism also makes us believe that we are separate. We are, society and economy are different from nature. This is a belief that spread with capitalism, and there is an exploitation of nature, of the natural resources, okay? And this is a problem. We need to rethink the connection between the economic production and our connection to nature, and this is really important in the age of global warming. And the other illusion is that there is a space of economic production that is self-sustaining, but without social reproduction, there cannot be economic reproduction. This is where the feminist Marxists are very helpful. We need the work of women in care, in giving childbirth and nurturing the next generation who's going to be able to work in the production sphere. So capitalism often makes us forget those other dimensions, and capitalism makes us forget that if things work well in a given country, it is because there is cruel exploitation on other parts of the planet. So this is what I'm trying to say with the idea of sugarcoating. And the way capitalism has been at play can be seen, and we're going to have various illustrations with a history of colonial New York. Just two more slides to conclude my big part. Anybody recognize this building? Artists? This is in London. This is the Tate Gallery. The Tate Gallery, and why do I mention that? Take a wild guess. The Tate was a family that made its fortune on sugar, the inventing of the sugar cubes, right? So there is a sugar coating as well here. We see the benefits of arts and benevolent givers, philanthropists, etc. But they have made their wealth thanks to the exploitation of slaves in sugar plantation in the West Indies, etc., and bringing the wealth here in New York, or in this case, in London. And behind sugar, there is a long history of battles. This is a rendering of a battle between British and the Spanish Armada. They were battling actually for access to the route to get to the triangular trade and to get the ability to actually get the sugar going, right? The plantation were in the West Indies. This is the so-called triangular trade with boats moving between England, West Africa, and West Indies and back to England. So one way they were bringing from, say, West Indies to UK or to New York, they were bringing raw material, the molasses, which was then transformed in New York or in London into refined sugar or rum, and then there were ready-made products brought on the ship from London or New York to the West Coast, and then they were bringing the slaves, the famous Middle Passage, okay? So the history of emancipation and decolonization here in the States is a history of creating its own triangular trade as opposed to the British triangular trade, and also getting a door in the foot of the Spanish, who were the first in using slaves. So this is for my part. Now Kamau is going to go into a few examples of New York.
How we doing? Word. I see some nodding. I see some scribbling. I see a thumbs up. Cool. Awesome. So Black Gotham experienced something that I started in 2010. Started by doing walking tours. Thanks for that shout out. And the walking tours made a lot of sense because if you're looking at the built environment for Black people in the 1600s, you're not really going to have too many actual sustained spaces. And there's violent gentrification that removed people from their homes over time, over centuries, over decades. And so doing a walking tour is the most efficient way to talk about that imprint and that impact. And so we love books, we love comics. I often have comic references as a way to explain things, but we're grading this graphic novel series using people. I'm a photographer, an artist, and so we use people as a way to step into those moments where the artifacts fade to black and say, let's begin to actually illustrate using people today to respond to the crimes of the past, where that erasure actually left these very major missing points. And so as a quick exercise, and I always do this on walking tours, so if you've already had this question, feel free to be bored for half a minute. But just by a quick show of hands, anybody here have a good visual sense of how the first 100 years of New York City looks? I see a hand there. I see a hand there. All right, cool. For those whose hands went up, what are we relying on to imagine the first century of New York? Historical maps.
Like depictions of what buildings look like back then. Like white people.
White people, excellent. Everything you just said, I wish was a soundbite because I could use that again and again. That's perfect. Maps, buildings, white people. That should be a hashtag. Yes. You named the place as well? Say the place again? Plays. All right, cool. We have some plays. Which plays have you seen? Hamilton, yes. We'll let that go. We'll talk to Dot again about Hamilton. So when you think about Hamilton, that's like Revolutionary era New York. It's right after that time period. If you think about maps and buildings and white people, that's intentional because maps are not our perspective unless you're a bird, right? And so the human perspective would be line of sight, to actually be in a situation where you see people and dimensions, not just buildings, but also people. And so when you say, and I love the quote, maps, buildings, white people, New York City had like 20% black people throughout British New York. It actually went up during the American Revolution because the Howard brothers had the first Emancipation Proclamation and declared slavery over. And so a lot of people who were in the South came up to the North and joined not only the British Army, but also people joined the Continental Army and fought with George Washington as well. And so when you miss that entire time period, you don't quite get a sense of what New York looks like. And so we're going to begin to peel back those layers. We're going to go back a few centuries, so might take some gear shifting. So this is a painting, but I think it's important to understand that paintings is media. And during the time period these paintings are created, they're as powerful as a TV channel. And these still exist today, and you might see this image, and you might not necessarily think anything is missing. This is a piece called Emancipation Day, and they're celebrating the British being kicked out of New York. They're trotting down Wall Street. City Hall is to their left. Right in front of them is Trinity Church. And somewhere behind them will be Pearl and Wall Street, where the slave market would have been. Anything missing from this image? I'm hearing a few things all at the same time. Yes, there's definitely some black folks missing. What else are we missing? Natives, yep. We have one over here, but he's bowing down and very happy. Yeah. He's a chief, and he's bowing to the white men on their horses, because that's what he does in this particular movie. What else are we missing?
The environment's pretty sanitized. You have sort of major landmarks, but you just said that there's, that's right by the state farming.
Mm-hmm. So yes, sanitized, and there's a very powerful set of images being set here with just the way the picture is being depicted. And one thing that I think I want to just restate is there are a lot of black people in New York City during this time period. But you won't know that from seeing these type of images. You also have no idea that black people did fight with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. And I've had some really cool conversations. One time there was a Marine, I was at a Yankees game. I was with a Jewish guy who's a Marine. He also was a tour guide. And we sat side by side and just out of nowhere became like best buddies for a day and just talked about immigration and black people fighting with the Marines, et cetera. And I think that those kind of things are often teased out and picked out. And if you go to Federal Hall today, there's a depiction of people during Revolutionary era, and the black people are only in the carriages or holding the horses. There's no depiction of actual black soldiers, but these things took place, but they are erased. Speaking of erasure, anybody ever seen this person before? Does anybody know who this is? Anybody? Wild guesses? Columbus, yes, we've heard of this guy, right? And so Christopher Columbus, he's in Spain, talking to the king and queen. He's in Cordoba, and he's about to go on this major exploration. But if you were able to just go back in time, just, a year, a few months, how does Spain look? Just like 1491, 1490. What's cool? Muslims, right? Muslims from where?
Cordoba.
Well, they've been there for some time. A lot of African Muslims, Moors have been there for centuries. And so part of before Columbus goes off to explore and sail the world, part of where you stop the story is just say, oh yeah, Columbus is here to discover things and discover America. But don't talk about the centuries of influence and impact that black Muslims had not only on Spain, but also on Europe. And that part of the conversation is completely erased and not talked about. When I say completely erased, bear with me. I know we can find it. We all have Google. But it's not a part of the ongoing narrative of the world. And so you start with Columbus exploring, but don't talk about the fact that where he is, the castle where he's talking to Ferdinand and Isabella, was built by African Muslims, and their impact has been there for centuries. Some say 800 years, some say 300. We'll just say centuries and cut the difference. Sound good? Anybody know who this person is a depiction of? He's known as Prester John, which is kind of like a Latin word, Prabster, which means elder, Johannes. He's supposed to be a person in Ethiopia who is this very important Christian king that the Portuguese and Spanish are trying to find throughout the 1500s and late 1400s. I'm not surprised no one's, I'm just curious. Has anybody heard this at all? One hand, two hands, awesome. If you haven't heard about it, it's all good. I'm not trying to shame people who don't know stuff. I don't know stuff. That's why I'm always talking, because that's how I learn. But Prester John becomes a fascination with the Portuguese because they're looking at the importance of having alliances with people in Africa that are not Muslim. And so part of their looking for Prester John, they discover this place called the Congo. And they begin this era of major European influence in Africa, but it's important to keep in mind that one of the contemporaries of this person who's Elder John of Ethiopia is this guy over here in the bottom right-hand corner holding a very important piece of gold. Anybody know who that person represents? Did I hear it? Mansa Musa? You ever heard of him? I'm seeing a hand go up. I thought I heard of Mansa Musa, but kind of low. Mansa Musa, wealthiest man in the world during his time period. And so what I'm trying to get to is that Africa is not this slow, uneducated, important place in the world. They more or less act as if all Europeans went into Africa and just dominated everybody from the very beginning of time and don't acknowledge that they're just trying to figure out how to get around Africa, get to India, and find allies to fight against Muslims, and not acknowledge that the reason why they even know how to navigate so well is because of the influence of African Moors. Follow? Does that make sense? How that's missing from the conversation? I say anything incorrect? Is silence also shade? Silence can be shade sometimes. All right, and so this is where we get to New York City. This is Afonso, king of the Congo. He has this interesting fusion of like Portuguese and African garb. The skirt is very Congo, the crown is very Portuguese. And he is somebody who was converted willfully to Catholicism, and he becomes an ally with the Portuguese, and part of that ally, that alliance turns into the beginnings of a slave trade between the Portuguese and the Congo, where they're taking people out of the country to pay for the price of civilizing them with Catholicism. And this is where we begin to get black bodies brought to the island of Mannahatta because they're coming from the Congo and Angola, but they're not coming to New Amsterdam. They're headed to like Brazil or the Caribbean, and they're being attacked by the enemies of the Portuguese. Any wild guesses who that is? Not the Spanish. The Iberian Peninsula are kind of like a gang of sorts. Somebody else doesn't like them very much. It's the Dutch. And so that's why we have a New Amsterdam, a New Netherland. It's during a time of war. And so this is an important time in the conversation of capitalism and globalism, because the Dutch, when they're attacking these slave ships, they're not slave traders. They're anti-slavery. But just imagine like an epic, finals game where you kind of have like the Dutch capitalists versus the Dutch Calvinists, and the capitalists win by like 2 points. They're kind of having this moral debate. The first 2 quarters, they're against slavery. They have a locker room conversation somewhere in the 1640s. They come out, they're down with slavery now. And that's the transition in the history of New Amsterdam before you get to New York City. And so you already have a global system in place before there is a New York. And so once New York City begins, it's going to only begin to continue and compound the connection that this island that we're on right now has with the West Indies and Africa, South America, etc. Everybody follow? So this is just part of the castle I was mentioning earlier in Cordoba. And then here we have Wall Street. What do we associate with Wall Street? I'm hearing laughter. Money, yes. It's important to keep in mind Wall Street is older than our country. Wall Street is older than New York. Wall Street is something that for a long time has been associated not only with exploitation, but very, important moments of violence and revolt. And so when you walk past Wall Street right now, what kind of things do you see? You might see the Trump building, Financial Museum. What else do we see? There you go. Subway Street, nice, important information, how to get around. Do we see any kind of information about the fact that people that might have been from Africa helped build Wall Street? Why is that not part of the conversation? And think about storytelling and layering and capitalism all happening in our lives right now. Because this is not, 1492. This is 2018. You walk down the street now, and how do we not know what's happening or what the history is all about? Why is that the case? Right, so that this, if you didn't hear what she said, it's like there's a narrative of whitewashing or telling a very specific story. And if you're a creative person, you might love stories and storytelling. But understand the politics of storytelling and how that begins to lock in place the systems that we become a part of. Like the public square is designed. It's open, it could be like a common area to exist in, but it's designed to give you a certain sense of what's possible and what isn't possible. What happened and what can happen again, or is not going to likely happen again. And so when you walk down Wall Street, they're not going to talk about certain people's contributions. They're not going to talk about the fact that there were protests about Wall Street before Occupy Wall Street 300 years prior. And so this begins to make us all behave in particular ways that help the system continue to move without interruption. So I'm not saying that we're all duped or we're all asleep, but this idea of layers and seeing the world in layers means that what's in front of you is not all you have to understand. What's in front of you is an intentional channel, it is a signal, but you have to look past it and see more than what's there, or you're not going to understand where you are. That was like 5 in a row. You've ever heard of the New York draft riots? Why they call it like the Civil War draft, right? Why they call it the draft riots when basically you have a lot of immigrant groups chasing wealthy people, but also lynching people, chasing black orphanages, and it's like one of the longest race riots you have in American history. Why do we not call it a race riot? We call it a draft riot. Why do we do that? Is that a hand or that was an itch? Sorry, then I don't want to. Because white people were the instigators. Fair. Anybody else?
There's a lot of Irish people too.
Yeah, there was a lot, 1,000%. And so I think that what you have is storytelling is a way to also cement culture and patterns that also continue the same cycles and systems. And if we actually were to sit back and own and talk about the fact that black people who had property and businesses were ran out and were chased and attacked, that gives you a whole different context for what New York City is. Why is that happening in New York City? It's supposed to be so progressive and so friendly to immigrants and to people who are different. Here we got a picture of cottons in the South, cotton plantations in the South. Does New York have anything to do with the cotton plantations in the South?
Well, yeah.
I heard a lot of yeses.
Did they import from the garment industry?
Importing, yes, importing, exporting. Politically, Fernando Wood was not a friend of the Union. He was not a friend of Abraham Lincoln. Part of the insurance that helped make slave masters more wicked and evil because they had underwriting for their property was coming from places like New York City and Connecticut. And so New York City as a colonial structure and then a capitalist structure is very much connected to sugar and cotton and capitalism in a way that we pretty much cover up and don't talk about and make it seem as if New York City isn't named after a slave trader, James Stewart, Duke of York, and isn't for the purpose of more or less creating places like a Wall Street that uses capitalism sometimes to violent effect. So this is part of why Benoit and I get along. because we talk a lot about how these layers are important to the different things that we find interesting. I might be in the public square, he might be looking at things a little bit more broader, but they all begin to come together and form these stories. Any burning questions at this point in time? Any comments? Who's this guy? And I liked how you said that. That was great. It's a great play. I haven't seen it yet. One thing about Hamilton I want to point out is that in addition to being somebody who was pushing for like a central government, he also was somebody who was pushing for the abolition of slavery in the state of New York. 1799, it was pushed. Him and John Jay. And the division between the North and the South did not start in 1860 or 1861. It started like in 1776, when there was debate about including slavery as one of the grievances that we had as colonists with our mother country. When I say our mother country, it's a double consciousness of American speak we have to have. But yeah, there was that whole idea that we were against slavery, but actually we had a couple states pull out of the revolution and say, we're not going to fight if we're going to complain about slavery. And so one thing you have that's very interesting in New York City, when New York is our nation's capital, where the Bill of Rights is written and signed, is there is a debate right here in New York, while Hamilton is a very powerful figure, about slavery being something that we want to get rid of. And so if we want to begin to look at some possible anecdotal evidence for why our country's capital isn't in New York and he's dead, I understand it was a duel, but there's a reason why that beef was popping off besides the fact he had an affair, if you look into the details. People didn't like the fact that John Jay and Hamilton were advocates of abolition and were powerful politicians in our nation's capital, especially Jefferson. You ever heard of that guy? Kind of an advocate of slavery. And so right here in New York, we have so many powerful examples of how these things come together. And that more or less is why we talk about seeing the layers. And I'm gonna just click to our last slide. This is what we created earlier. And you see how this, is turned into a JPEG. But if you think about it, when you have access to all the layers, you can have a much deeper conversation about where you are and what's going on. And so yes, at one point in time, it was a PSD, lots of layers to have to interact with, but then it can be also turned into a JPEG, compressed and made simple, but it also stops the conversation. But when you have all the layers, the talk is a lot more deeper.
Great. Can I have the remote control again? Because I need to go a few layers. Thank you. Microphone. Oh. Yes. So couple of slides to conclude is start with this. Okay, what is new? What are we trying to bring with this conversation we're having? Okay, I think we need to bring hand in hand two different histories, currents of history, local and global histories. That's what we're trying to do. And in terms of thinking capitalism, I'm trying also to wrap my head around this multifaceted dimension, the global dimension of capitalism. And there's one famous idea of capitalism, critical theory of capitalism and notion of space, exclusion of space, is the idea of David Harvey of spatial fix. Is that capitalism, when it hits a bottleneck, tries to be inventive. I mean, capitalism doesn't exist. People pushing for capitalist solution are creative. And they often have this idea of a spatial fix. We have little space on this island, so we're going to make new space. This is this slide here, right? We have little space, so we're going to create this. And then in the 60s, it's Battery Park, right? And this part, which is, okay, real estate is big money here in New York, so we need to expand and create. So this is spatial fix. The notion of spatial fix that David Harvey is a good idea, but I think it's misleading because it concentrates on the physical space. And the whole point that Kamau and I are trying to do is thinking the social life, the social relation, and the complexity of life, multiple lives, walks of like origin, enslaved people, manumitted, natives, women, etc., and how those people are the life of those people is changed because of the expansion of capitalism. So rather than thinking of spatial fix, I'm inviting you to think of capitalism as a force that has the power of relayering. So there is different layers of the physical space, the geographical space, the urban space, but there is also a relayering of the social relation, the social space in which we are. So this is why we have the slides here. The social space reminds us that there are new people, all right? We went beyond the enslavement, but there are new social groups that are pushed on the margins by the expansion of capitalism, hence the idea of the sugar factory, right, and gentrification. But other people outside of New York are producing cheap goods that allow us to live on this island, and all the silent workers, etc. And so this idea of the layering and relayering is a way to think in dynamic terms, and in a way that goes beyond our understanding of capitalism as an economic system. It's a social, it's a historical force that transforms social relations. So example of today's of relayering, we talked about sugar, which was replaced in certain cases by cotton. Now we could have new commodities that matter greatly for capitalism. Palm oil. Palm oil is the new frontier of, using tropical land, cheap labor, producing this commodity, which is in everything that you eat or you use for lipstick or shampoo or whatever. It's everywhere. Palm oil is that. And my pension fund at the New School, they invest in those new forms of land development. Okay, so we are all part of this relayering and this global relayering. And this is what, the political lessons, if you want, is that from the history of New York, there is something to be learned about the world we live in. And some takeaways, I'm just gonna conclude here. I mean, maybe Kamau can say, he said something about the notion of layers. I just want to say that what is important for me in combining the history of settler colonialism with a critical understanding of capitalism is that we need to think not in isolation, but we need to think in conjunctions. We need to bring different forces, and we need to think of who are the social groups who have been and who are excluded by the expansion of global capitalism, and we need to bring them together. This is really important. And the lessons of settler colonialism is that, we put the focus on all those historical actors that we've described here. The spread of capitalism through colonialism and imperialism, the exclusion, dispossession of the natives, the enslaved people, the indentured labor, the specific places, a role that women played in producing the new migrant community, and people of color, etc. So we have to think in conjunction and try to think transversally, if you want, and try to bring solidarity in on the table and see how process of exclusion here or process of exclusion there. And the last lessons of settler colonialism is a bit of optimism, okay? Is that if you look at what's going on in pushing back against the dispossession and the elimination of the natives in Latin America, in the United States, in Africa, you see that there is a process of recognition, gradual recognition of the rights of the languages, the spoken languages of the native population, or a return to re-giving possession of the land. So there is a possibility to change the conversation and push for a form of recognition of the past atrocities, and generate a new agenda. And without this political imagination, without the exercise that Kamau also makes us do here in New York, in colonial New York, and seeing the active contribution that varieties of people have had in this city. If we have this political imagination, I think we could hopefully change also the agenda and have a different conversation, which is not just about the privilege, the few privilege, but the role of the many.
Cool. Anybody have any questions, comments? Yes.
You talked a lot about different peoples who were erased from geography, but I was always fascinated why Native American names still persist so much in our settler colonial society. If we really wanted to erase them, why do we put their name, like Manhattan, I guess, right? It's a tribe name. Is there something, part of the story that we need to tell their names still to help understand ourselves? I don't know why they persist.
Right. This is a great question. I start? Okay.
I have a comment.
It's true. I mean, part of the argument in settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, for example, has suggested that, settler colonialism is the destruction of the native. It's a genocidal project. Probably 90 million people died in the Americas after the discovery, right? And the great discoveries, right? The figure is, this is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz that gives this figure, is probably overstated, but let's say 50 million people. It is a genocide. So the argument is like, if there is an elimination, a process of elimination, why do we speak so much of the Indians, or why do we have the names of? Okay, so there's a potential tension in the argument. So it's not about the destruction and the elimination, since we use their name, etc. So the argument here is that we have to look at the time in which the names have been systematically used and made part of our landscape. And this is in the 19th century, at a time where the United States is soul searching, and there is an imagination of unity through the image of the Indians, right? The Indians don't exist. There were 450 nations or tribes, whatever you want to call it, okay? Why do we call them Indian? I mean, it's a nonsense, right? They're not Indians, they're natives, they're First Nations, etc. But we thought, European, I speak as European, we thought that we were in India landing here, right? So, but by giving, by unifying the various groups into one label, the Indians, there was a process of self-unification about the American population, which was a migrant society coming from different backgrounds in Europe. So the argument is that the unification and the overpresence of Indian names, etc., is functional to the creation of a national identity, of the self-identity of the WASP, of the white American Anglo-Saxon Protestant society. This is the argument. That's one of the argument, and there are other interpretation. But I think it makes sense to think of unifying the Indian as a process to unifying ourselves here, I speak as an American migrant or settler, right? The centrality of Indians in, for example, in cinema. This is the first films that are made in the United States are about Indians. And it's part of the imaginary of the cowboys and the frontier. But this is this idea of this is our land, right? And we can take it. And so this has played an important role in the imaginary. And that also reinforced the presence of Indians in our American imaginary.
For the sake of time, I'm going to give a quick non-empirical anecdotal response. Once upon a time, the idea of American was specifically meant people who were First Nations. The Democratic Party came out of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall took their name from a First Nation chief to base their identity on, because many people that were Irish saw in some of the practices of like painting and folklore, they felt connectivity with people that were First Nation. And so for some time, there was a romanticism around people that were First Nation that would shock us to this day, because we would imagine looking backwards, looking from Andrew Jackson's Tale of Tears, that they were always despised. They were looked up to and respected in many respects for different points in time. If you think about it, without, Massasoit and the Wampanoags, our so-called pilgrims would have died. And so for some time, people did have a very clear level of reverence for First Nations. We see like that racial hatred that comes later, but there were definitely moments in time where different people interacting with the First Nations had lots of respect with how they also had their political structure set up versus how kings and queens just kind of had this is what you do versus coming together and having a conversation. Even to this day, people still use totem pole as a way of talking about where you are in society. That also is the lift from First Nation culture. I could go on, but that's part of why I think that is persists.
And there's also it's also part of the sugarcoating process. Like it gives the illusion by showing that we use their name, that we respect them, we bought the land, etc. And it's all.
I saw another hand, yes, and then.
So thinking about a slightly different period of time in American history, like around Bacon's Rebellion, right? You see black slaves, natives, white immigrants, indentured servants kind of unifying against this upper elite class of white landowners. And out of that, right, we saw in our racial history of this country creating political systems to kind of enforce this racial caste system in where those groups don't see any common ground, and indentured servants that are white are given like power to enforce or oversee black slaves, things like that. So thinking about colonial labor, right, what role does capitalism in particular, you think, kind of create or further a similar racial caste system, or the kind of segregation of those castes?
Yeah, can everybody hear a question? Because I would repeat it, but it's pretty intricate, and I hope you heard her. Great question. Two instances. One is in the 1740s, and one I would say is right around like 1890s or like early like 1900s. Going backwards, you ever heard of the idea of the melting pot? It's based off of a 1908 Yiddish play that was popular in the Lower East Side, and that's where you had people that were bringing their hyphen with them, and they weren't white. They were some version of an American, right? But the idea of a melting pot was that people who were European could go inside this large cauldron and come out white and American and not be whatever they were before they got off the boat. Become white, right? So even whiteness itself is also a product of capitalism, where it's kind of like you're determining who your different workers are in the factory. And so the identity of whiteness also has some, a lot of residue around capitalism as well. But this notion of whiteness is part of what actually happens here in New York in a way that didn't happen in prior centuries. There's not people in the 1600s not fighting because they're all white. They're like, you're the wrong, Christian, so I'm going to kill you for hundreds of years. And so whiteness is something that begins to become a very important device to connect different immigrant groups against people that are then othered, which is why you have this Civil War riot, which really is a race riot, where people are beginning to harden with this notion of whiteness, where they are attacking people who are not white, more than just attacking people who are black per se. It's a combination. The other one is in 1741, there is a Negro Plot, or a New York history conspiracy. It happens, it's like 10 fires between March 18th and April 6th, 1741. And the plot was to overthrow the British government. And the main actors in that were people who were enslaved, working with people who were poor Irish, who also didn't like the British. After that plot is discovered and put down violently, they began to create white privilege. This is in British New York. This is before America. They began to take some of the jobs that enslaved people did and give it to poor whites, and begin to elevate this notion that even though you're poor and I've taken your country and you ain't jack to me, but somehow I want to make your phenotype gives you some sense of you're a part of the team, but you're not. It's just like going to a Patriots game and feeling like you and Brady are the same. You're not. And so these are two instances that happen in New York where you begin to create differences, not only between people of a similar class, but also people of a similar phenotype and class. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think just a quick follow-up. Would you say a lot of those instances, like the examples you just gave, are driven by primarily like economic motivations, like capitalism, or by political structures that are created by?
I think that's like a caterpillar butterfly scenario. Same animal. I'm sorry, you are next. After the lady, because she's, I'm sorry, I did forget. I'm bad. I owe you a beer. They're free.
It's not a question, it's a comment. It's just I noticed how similar the old Mannahatta like map looks to projections of the consequences of global warming in the next couple of years, of how when sea levels rise, how that old map of Manhattan looks remarkably similar to how the map of Manhattan will probably look as sea levels rise, and the consequences of capitalism progress.
No, that's I applaud that irony that you pointed out.
Except that because of the layering, Manhattan is slightly higher above the water. And if you watch, there's a sci-fi show, The Expanse. I don't know if anybody's seen it. There's a wall around New York City precisely to prevent the flood.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
It seemed to me that this would be a great opportunity for learning experience for children, elementary school, because that's where, let's say, most people in this room learn history from very sugar-coated books. So what are the opportunities, how do you see this today? I don't know that you know that answer, but I'm thinking like children about history, or even New York City children, which include walking through with children. Because those are the people that really are going to be, no mom, that's not, I'm wrong. No mom, that's not right, you know, so on and so forth. So, because they're the little sponges that are in the future, not the corny.
No, I mean, corn's important, so corny will have it. I mean, for those who know the origin story of Black Gotham, without children, it wouldn't happen. I mean, like Benoit's daughter, somebody curious like her, she had pigtails and was darker, but she was brilliant just like her. And she basically asked me a question after a tour I gave to Tenement, like, where's the black people at? I spent 90 minutes talking about people from, German, Jewish, Italian stories, and she was just kind of like not bored, but just expected me as a black educator talking to black kids to give a little bit of something, and I had nothing. And she was just kind of like, bruh, right? And so now I talk to like third graders, fifth graders, senior faculty, and because we're making it visual, anybody who can see and can, walk and can have a sense of play can get into the stories. And so we do have conversations with school groups. We are a small organization. We're powered by people more than anything. And so if anybody has, feedback or questions or have access to schools, I can talk to you after this is over, because that's really how we often make these things happen. And we've had tours from universities like Benoit's class all the way to like people who are special needs in third grade who asked some of the best questions I ever had from any tour group. And so I think that ultimately looking at how we got started from a question 10 years ago, we have a lot of fun doing what we're doing, but we always look at our guiding star is how do we get this into the environment so young people are able to like grow up with this sense of layering where they can see what's missing and see themselves in history. I think that's part of damaging when people don't see themselves in history, because then that can affect your self-concept, self-esteem, and minimize what you think is possible in your lifetime. And that, I think, is an act of violence. One more question?
Okay.
Something that you said that was interesting to me is that when capitalism reaches a bottleneck, that gets created. And I would say that probably, in my opinion, in the last 20 years, that creativity has come out of the tech sector or dot-com boom and past that. And I was wondering if in what you guys study, you have seen a new erasure of identities or of peoples because of that creativity, or whether it's just a compounding of the erasures that were already there, which basically put, the tech geniuses who are predominantly white that we see publicly, it's just a compounding of what has already existed, or whether this new industry and this new development is going to mean a different kind of erasure, than whether we can tell that now, or whether that's something we're only going to see in hindsight.
It's a great question. I think the erasure will not, there is the process of gentrification, which is quite obvious, but the process of erasure will take place outside of our eyes. But it goes on, this new this creativity, right? It's a history of transformation from the agriculture into the industrial sector, into the tertiary, and the waterfront in Somerset Park, etc. It's all about this new tech transforming the warehouse and those boats, docks, etc. They transform. So clearly, it is there, and you have people who are excluded through the example in the sugar factory in Williamsburg. it's you know, there is also something about the creativity. It's also the learning curve among capitalist planners, is that they understood that there was a concentration in 19th century working class in working neighborhoods, and that was a bad idea because they would assemble solidarity and reclaim their rights, etc. So their lesson learned to break the ability of solidarity or people to come together. That makes it difficult to have a linear learning from the past into the future. And we all, you know, atomize in our little bubbles, and it's difficult to create a sense of, I mean, I'm answering it in another question, I guess, is like, how can we get together, right, and react and push back? It's not exactly your question, but I think we're on the same page on that. And it's difficult to imagine this coming together because of the fragmentation that has, you know, become reality.
If I get a quick stab at the same question, I think that part of it is you're mentioning how erasure is being applied now, like in the tech sector to some degree, or how the tech sector is a form of creativity, how that's impacting. I think that part of what's being erased now is like a sense of reality itself. And I think that people are really like sucked into like a warp. And I don't think that it's necessarily one that is all being done in a coordinated form of design, but I think that it is being leveraged in a way where people are being pulled into like these bubbles where you see things the way you want to see them, your friends are who you believe in, and you don't often like get a chance to really have critical thought and be challenged, and being challenged is somehow an act of like, you know, existential threat. That's something I feel is a very destructive form of our new form of creativity, where people don't have to deal with facts or reality. And I think that that's pervasive, and it's not just politics. It's also the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are both just kind of like decide what facts they want and what truth they want. And that's problematic, obviously, but I think that that's part of why I think these kind of face-to-face human being conversations are important, because, you know, here we are breathing the same air. And I think that's an important part of, you know, the solution and what we don't want to have, you know, lost.
Well, we thank you all for coming tonight, for your great question and comments. Thanks for the staff at Strand for organizing this.
And ThinkOlio.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.